Ambassador Corella stood before the High Council chambers, her iridescent scales gleaming under the harsh light of 3 suns streaming through the crystal dome. After 15 years of flawless service, she had finally achieved her dream position as senior ambassador to the Galactic core worlds. The position would let her represent the glory of the Xeraxian Empire among the most advanced civilizations in known space. The Council Elder's next words shattered that dream. "You are being reassigned to the human delegation." Corella's secondary heart stopped beating for a moment. Her primary one thundered in compensation, sending a flush of deep purple across her scales, a betrayal of emotion she hadn't displayed since her juvenile molt. "There must be some mistake," she managed, her voice steady despite the internal chaos. "I'm qualified for core world diplomacy. The human delegation is a post for junior ambassadors, the kind who haven't proven themselves yet," she didn't add. The elder's facial tendrils twisted in what might have been sympathy or disgust. "Your predecessor, Ambassador Varrock, took his own life 3 cycles ago. The position must be filled." Corella's crest flattened against her skull. Everyone knew about Varrock. He had been brilliant, stable, with centuries of experience. After 3 months with the humans, he had walked into hard vacuum without his pressure suit. The official story called it an accident. The whispers in diplomatic circles told a different tale. Surely there are others. "You have shown remarkable resilience in difficult posts," another elder cut in. "Your work with the Hive Mind Collective was exemplary. The humans are challenging in different ways, but we believe you can handle them." Handle them, like they were savage beasts needing to be contained, which, Corella reflected, wasn't far from the truth. Humans had somehow stumbled onto faster-than-light travel barely a century after discovering nuclear fission. They were children playing with superweapons, emotions ruling their every decision. "When do I begin?" she asked, knowing protest was futile. "Immediately. Their new representative arrives today." Corella's scales rippled in shock. No time to prepare. No time to study their bizarre customs or their primitive psychological profiles. It was almost as if the council wanted her to fail. The thought struck her like a plasma bolt. Perhaps they did. Perhaps this wasn't a punishment, but a test. 3 hours later, Corella waited in the diplomatic reception chamber, her posture perfect, her scales polished to a mirror shine. She would show these humans what true civilization looked like. The chamber doors slid open. Corella had prepared herself for many things: the humans' unsettling lack of scales, their excess of internal organs, their constant leaking of water through their skin. She wasn't prepared for Dr. Marcus Chen's eyes. They were dark, like most of his species, but they held an intelligence that stripped away her diplomatic armor. He studied her with an intensity that reminded her of the great predators in her homeworld's deep oceans. Not aggressive, but aware of everything. "Ambassador Corella," he said, executing a perfect formal bow at exactly the correct angle for her rank. "Your reputation precedes you. The hive mind speaks very highly of your work in the collective." He spoke flawless High Xeraxian, even capturing the subtle harmonic undertones that most species missed. Corella felt her scales trying to shift to orange, surprise, and force them still. "Dr. Chen," she responded in standard Galactic, refusing to acknowledge his linguistic skills. "I trust you'll find our facilities adequate for your primitive needs." The insult was clear. Any proper diplomat would either take offense or pretend not to notice. Instead, Chen smiled. A human gesture involving too many teeth that should have been threatening but somehow wasn't. "Actually, I find them rather luxurious compared to my last posting," he said. "Did you know humans have a saying? The best steel is forged in the hottest fires. I look forward to seeing what we can forge together, Ambassador." Corella felt her secondary heart skip again. This human was dangerous, not in the usual chaotic way of his species, but in how easily he had turned her insult into an opportunity for connection. She would have to be very careful around Dr. Marcus Chen. Lara arrived at the embassy precisely at first light, only to find Ambassador Marcus Chen had been there for an hour already. He stood in the entrance hall, dressed in formal Valkyrian mourning black, studying the ceremonial wall etchings with an intensity that made her scales prickle. "You're early," she said, her universal translator flattening the accusation in her tone. Corella spent 3 days planning the perfect diplomatic disaster. The Feast of Ancestors was sacred to her people, a ritual where every dish, every gesture carried centuries of meaning. One misstep could trigger an interstellar incident. She had arranged everything precisely wrong, a calculated insult that would expose human inadequacy without technically violating any treaties. The ceremonial hall gleamed with bioluminescent crystals, their light reflecting off the scaled bodies of 24 Xeraxian dignitaries. Dr. Chen was the only human present, his smooth skin and dark formal wear making him stand out like a void among stars. The first course, Corella announced in standard Galactic, is the breath of dawn. She watched Chen carefully as servers presented the dish. Timeline fruit served on beds of crystallized sugar. It should have been served last, as timeline fruit represented the future. Beginning with it was blasphemy. Chen's eyes widened slightly as he studied the dish. This was it. He would either eat it and insult everyone present, or refuse and appear weak. Instead, he stood. "Ambassador Corella honors us deeply," he said in perfect high Xeraxian, those harmonics again sending shivers through her scales. To begin with the breath of dawn, it speaks to the human belief that every meeting is a new beginning, a fresh start. He lifted the ceremonial fork. In offering us the future first, she reminds us that what we do here shapes all that follows. The dignitary's scales shifted to pleased gold. Corella's secondary heart hammered in frustration. Somehow he turned her insult into poetry. She tried again with the second course, serving bitter roots meant to honor the dead alongside sweet meats that celebrated life. The combination was practically sacrilege. Chen took a bite, his expression thoughtful. "The interplay of flavors," he said, "reminds me of an ancient human philosophy, that life and death are not opposites, but partners in an eternal dance." How clever of our hosts to demonstrate this through traditional Xeraxian cuisine. By the fifth course, Corella was fighting to maintain her diplomatic composure. Every trap she'd laid, Chen had transformed into a bridge between their cultures. Worse, she found herself fascinated by his interpretations, seeing her own traditions through new eyes. The final course arrived, the most deliberately wrong of all. She'd served the sacred silence, a clear broth meant for solitary contemplation, in shared bowls. The intimacy of sharing food was reserved for family units among her people. Even married couples waited years before eating from the same dish. Chen studied the arrangement, and for the first time, she saw him hesitate. Her scales rippled in triumph. Finally, she'd caught him. "Before we begin," he said softly, switching to standard Galactic, "I must ask the ambassador's permission." He turned to her, those dark eyes intense. "On Earth, sharing food is how we turn strangers into family. Would you do me the honor of sharing this bowl and teaching me the proper way to contemplate the sacred silence?" The room went still. Corella felt the eyes of every dignitary on her. If she refused, she'd appear petty, rejecting a genuine gesture of cultural exchange. If she accepted, she found herself moving before she'd fully decided, kneeling across from him at the low table. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the ceremonial spoon. "One sips in complete silence," she heard herself explaining, focusing on the journey that brought us to this moment. Chen nodded, matching her movements with unexpected grace. As they shared the broth in silence, Corella found herself studying his face. There was something almost Xeraxian in his focused stillness, an ancient soul behind those alien eyes. When the bowl was empty, Chen bowed deeply. "Thank you for sharing your traditions with me, Ambassador." Corella realized with horror that her scales had shifted to the soft blue of peaceful contentment. She stood abruptly, forcing them back to diplomatic neutrality. "The ceremony is concluded," she announced, refusing to acknowledge the warmth in her primary heart. She had failed to expose human barbarity, but tomorrow was another day. She ignored the small voice, wondering if she really wanted to succeed. The human turned, and Tilera experienced her first diplomatic shock of the day. She had expected the typical human martial stance. Their species had only recently emerged from their latest war, after all. Instead, Ambassador Chen's posture was almost Valkyrian in its careful precision. "Commander Tilera," he said, inclining his head at exactly the correct angle for greeting a military superior. "I apologize if I violated any protocols by arriving early. I wanted to understand the space before the formal ceremonies began." Tilera's inner eyelids flickered rapidly. The human had pronounced her name perfectly, including the subtle trill that most species missed. "You speak Valkyrian." "Badly," he admitted, and his face did something complicated that Tilera couldn't interpret. "But I'm learning. Your language's contextual harmonics are fascinating. Did you know it shares structural similarities with what we call Mandarin Chinese?" "You're wearing mourning colors," she said, ignoring his attempt at linguistic discussion. "Is this meant to mock our customs?" The human's expression shifted again. These constant facial movements were going to give her a headache, and he gestured to the wall etchings. "These mark the Week of Remembrance, yes. On Earth, many cultures also wear black to honor the dead. I thought, perhaps our shared respect for those who came before might be a bridge between our peoples." Tilera felt her neck frills betraying her again. The human was either incredibly well-informed or dangerously intuitive. Neither option comforted her. The formal reception began exactly on schedule, though it nearly ended in disaster when Ambassador Chen committed the ultimate taboo. He laughed. The sound echoed through the ceremonial hall, causing every Valkyrian present to freeze in horror. But before Tilera could intervene, Chen turned the social catastrophe into an impromptu sinological discussion. "Fascinating," he said, addressing the shocked scientists present. "Your species experiences humor but suppresses the physical response. Humans developed laughter as a social bonding mechanism. It's actually one of our oldest evolutionary adaptations. The physical act releases endorphins and strengthens group cohesion. Would you be interested in comparing the neurological structures involved?" The scientists, despite their perfect Valkyrian training, couldn't quite hide their interest. Within minutes, what should have been a formal diplomatic reception had transformed into an academic symposium on comparative xenobiology. Hilera found herself taking notes almost despite herself. The human moved through the crowd with practiced ease, turning every potential offense into an opportunity for cultural exchange. When he used the wrong ceremonial greeting, he sparked a discussion about the evolution of formal language. When he accidentally activated his translator's emotional sensors, strictly forbidden in formal Valkyrian settings, he turned it into a debate about the role of technology in diplomatic relations. "Your species fears emotion will compromise logic," he said to Tilera during a brief quiet moment. "Humans learn to integrate both. Sometimes the most logical choice is to listen to what our feelings tell us about a situation." "That makes no sense," Tilera replied. "I look forward to discussing it further." That complicated expression crossed his face again, something humans call a smile, though it looked nothing like the aggressive baring of teeth she'd seen in the war footage. "After all, we'll be working closely together." Tilera watched him return to the crowd, her perfect memory already cataloging dozens of protocol violations that had somehow transformed into diplomatic successes. She had expected to document human weaknesses. Instead, she found herself questioning whether she truly understood what weakness and strength meant. She definitely needed another hour of meditation. Minimum. The grand diplomatic gala aboard the Centauri Exchange Station was a symphony of light and motion. Representatives from 30 species mingled beneath floating crystal chandeliers, their varied anatomies creating an ever-shifting tapestry of alien grace. Grella stood apart from the crowd, her scales gleaming with carefully cultivated disdain. Quite the gathering. Dr. Chen materialized beside her, somehow moving silently despite the formal boots all humans seemed to favor. though I noticed the Xeraxian delegation seems reserved. Grella's crest twitched. She'd positioned her people strategically around the room, ensuring no species could claim they'd been snubbed while maintaining proper distance from the humans. "We prefer dignity to spectacle," she said, watching a group of Arturians performing their infamous gravity-defying acrobatics. And yet, Chen's eyes sparkled with that unsettling intelligence. The dance of truth is considered one of the greatest artistic achievements in the galaxy. Grella's scales rippled before she could stop them. The dance was sacred, a test of worth young Xeraxians spent years mastering. Each movement had to be perfect. One mistake could shame your entire lineage. A human couldn't possibly understand its significance, she said, the words emerging sharper than intended. "Then teach me." The conversation around them stuttered to a halt. Even the Arturians paused mid-spin. "You dare." Corella's crest fully extended, a display of challenge she couldn't suppress. The dance takes years to master. The slightest error dishonors not just the dancer, but all who witness it. Chen's smile held no mockery, only genuine interest. "Then I accept the consequences of failure." The gathering crowd parted as Corella led him to the central platform. Her scales burned with anticipation. Finally, proof of human inadequacy before the entire diplomatic course. "The first form," she announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "represents the birth of truth from chaos." She demonstrated, her body flowing through the ancient movements. Each gesture had to be precise to the millimeter, each turn exactly measured. No human could possibly. Chen moved. His interpretation was wrong. It had to be wrong. But it held something she'd never seen before. Where Xeraxian dancers moved with geometric precision, he added an organic flow that somehow captured the chaos they sought to tame. His movements honored the traditional form while transforming it into something new. Grella found herself responding before she could think, her body moving into the second form. Chen matched her, their dance becoming a conversation. Each time she tried to trap him with an especially complex sequence, he answered with innovations that stayed true to the dance's meaning while breaking its rigid rules. The third form blended into the fourth, then the fifth. Corella's hearts thundered as she realized they were approaching the movement of unity, traditionally performed by bonded pairs to symbolize truth's universal nature. She should stop. This had gone far beyond a simple challenge. Instead, she extended her arm in invitation. Chen accepted, his hand warm against her scales. They moved together, their differences becoming strengths. Where she was precise, he was fluid. Where he was grounded, she was ethereal. The dance transformed around them, becoming something neither human nor Xeraxian, but something entirely new. As the final notes faded, Corella found herself pressed against Chen's chest, their faces centimeters apart. His breath brushed her scales, sending shivers down her spine. For a moment, she forgot about the watching crowd, lost in those deep, intelligent eyes. Then reality crashed back. She jerked away, her scales cycling through colors so rapidly several observers gasped. Without a word, she fled the platform, pushing through the stunned audience. "Ambassador," Chen called after her. She didn't stop until she reached her private chambers. Her reflection showed scales still shimmering with colors she hadn't displayed since childhood. Wonder, confusion, and something deeper she refused to name. "Computer," she commanded, her voice shaking, "download all available data on human dance traditions." She ignored the voice in her head asking what she was really afraid of, that humans were capable of understanding her culture, or that she was beginning to understand them. The research archives were Corella's sanctuary. Here, among the ancient data crystals and humming servers, she could pretend the last week hadn't happened, that she hadn't spent hours studying human dance, trying to understand how Chen had transformed the dance of truth into something so beautiful. The first warning was subtle, a slight temperature increase that made her scales tingle pleasantly. Xeraxians preferred heat, and she initially welcomed it. Then the emergency lights flashed crimson. Environmental control failure. The computer announced in 6 languages. Temperature approaching critical levels. All personnel evacuate immediately. Grella moved toward the exit, then froze. The preservation protocols hadn't activated. Centuries of cultural data, stored in temperature-sensitive crystals, would be destroyed. Her claws flew across the control panel, trying to engage the backup systems. Nothing responded. The temperature continued to rise. Ambassador. Chen's voice crackled through her communicator. The evacuation's almost complete. Where are you? She shouldn't answer. Relations between their species would improve if she simply disappeared. The archives, she found herself saying. The preservation systems aren't responding. Get out of there. The cooling systems are completely failed. We're reading 45 degrees Celsius and climbing. Grella's scales rippled in confusion. That's barely warm. It's lethal for humans. Chen's voice was strained. Promise me you'll evacuate. She disconnected instead, focusing on transferring the most critical data to portable crystals. The temperature hit 50 degrees, comfortable for her species, but apparently dangerous for humans. Good. No one would be foolish enough to. The archive doors hissed open. Chen stumbled in, already drenched in that disturbing human cooling liquid. What are you doing? Corella demanded. You'll die. Probably, he agreed, moving to help her with the crystals. But you're here, so I'm here. The simple statement hit her like a gravitational wave. I don't understand. Don't you? He smiled despite his obvious distress. After the dance, I thought. A thunderous crack interrupted him as the station's structural supports began to fail. The temperature had passed 55 degrees. We have to go, Chen gasped. Now. Grella grabbed the last crystal. They ran for the exit, but the heat had warped the corridors. Twice they had to backtrack, precious minutes ticking away. Chen's movements grew increasingly unsteady. They were still 2 sections from the evacuation point when he collapsed. Grella caught him before he hit the deck. His skin burned against her scales, not with a pleasant warmth from their dance, but with a heat that was killing him. Without conscious thought, she lifted him, cradling his larger frame against her chest. Leave me, he mumbled. Too heavy. Silence, she ordered, her translator struggling with the emotion in her voice. Humans talk too much. She ran, ignoring the groaning station around them, focusing only on the rhythm of Chen's weakening heartbeat against her scales. One heart. So fragile. So strong. The evacuation pod appeared ahead just as the corridor behind them collapsed. Grella dove through the closing doors, wrapping her body around Chen to protect him from the impact. They lay there as the pod launched, Grella's jewel hearts thundering while Chen's single one struggled to stabilize. Medical teams would be waiting at the destination. He would survive. He had to survive. Why? She whispered, not sure if he could still hear her. Why did you come back? His eyes opened slightly, those impossible depths finding hers even through his delirium. Because, his voice was barely audible. You're worth burning for. Something broke inside Corella's carefully constructed world. Her scales shifted to colors she'd never displayed before, telling truths she wasn't ready to accept. She held him closer, willing her naturally cool blood to help ease his fever. Rest, she told him. We will discuss your foolishness when you recover. His smile was faint but real. Looking forward to it. Grella watched him slip into unconsciousness, knowing her life had irreversibly changed. She had wanted to prove humans were primitive, dangerous, and chaotic. Instead, this one had proven himself noble, selfless, and impossibly warm in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. 3 days after the archive incident, Grella stood before her quarters viewing window, watching Chen's recovery through the medical bay's observation panel. The humans had insisted on transparency about his treatment, another of their strange customs that now seemed less barbaric and more admirable. Her data tablet chimed. A priority message from the High Council. Her scales prickled with unease as she decoded it. The first line stopped both her hearts. Operation Primitive Purge is proceeding as planned. Human delegation to be eliminated during tomorrow's peace summit. Maintain deniability. Glory to the Empire. Attached files revealed the full scope of the plot. Planted evidence suggesting humans had sabotaged the environmental systems, creating a pretext for war. The archive incident hadn't been an accident. It was a failed first attempt. Corella's scales shifted to ash-gray horror. She had almost lost Chen to her own people's hatred. Her communicator buzzed. Ambassador. Chen's voice was still weak. The doctors say I can receive visitors. I was hoping. Stay where you are, she cut him off. Don't trust anyone. I'm coming. She was halfway to the door when it hissed open, revealing 4 Zeraxian security officers. Ambassador Corella. The leader's scales rippled with false sympathy. The council requests your immediate presence. Of course, she kept her voice steady. Allow me to gather my diplomatic seals. She moved toward her desk, fingers brushing the emergency beacon Chen had given her just in case. At the time, she'd found his paranoia amusing. The leader's scales shifted to attack red. Now, Ambassador. Corella triggered the beacon and dove behind her desk as stun pulses scorched the air. She heard Chen's voice through her still-active communicator. Hold on. We're coming. Traitor. The leader spat. Corrupted by human weakness. Corella laughed, surprising herself. Weakness. They survive with one heart, yet love more deeply than our two have ever allowed. They walk into fire for those they barely know. What weakness do you see? A stun pulse grazed her shoulder, sending pain through her scales. She heard boots in the corridor. Human boots, running instead of sliding. The security team turned as her office wall exploded inward. Human security forces burst through, led by Chen himself. He shouldn't have been able to stand, let alone fight. But there he was. The battle was brief and decisive. Human stun weapons, designed for multiple species, proved remarkably effective against Zeraxian scales. Perfect timing. Corella managed, her injured scales shifting between pain white and relief blue. Chen knelt beside her, his hands gentle on her wounded shoulder. I figured out the archive sabotage. Didn't think they'd move against you so soon. They plan to assassinate your entire delegation tomorrow. Her voice shook. My own people. I never saw the hatred beneath our superiority. Hey. Chen's fingers brushed her crest, an intimacy that should have horrified her. Instead, her scales shifted to colors she still couldn't name. You saw it. You chose to fight it. That's what matters. The council will declare me exile. The words hurt more than her injury. Everything I've worked for. Then we'll find something better to work for. He helped her up, steady despite his own weakness. Your knowledge of both cultures could build bridges instead of walls. If you want. The human security team efficiently secured the assassins while giving them privacy. Another surprising show of sensitivity from supposed primitives. Grella looked at Chen, seeing him truly. He had nearly died saving her people's knowledge, then risen from his sickbed to save her. Perhaps this was why humans had achieved so much so quickly. They didn't let little things like impossibility stop them. The council has files, she said. Evidence of the plot. If we can access them. Already on it. Chen grinned. Humans have a saying. The best defense is a good offense. You have too many sayings. But her scales rippled with affection. And you. He touched her uninjured shoulder. Have too many colors I still need to learn. Corella felt the last of her old prejudices crumble. There would be consequences, dangers, and challenges ahead. But facing them with this impossible human seemed less like exile, and more like evolution. The human diplomatic compound felt alien in all the wrong ways. The temperature was too cold, requiring Corella to wear a thermal regulator. The humidity made her scales itch. Yet after 2 weeks of exile, she found herself noticing different things. The way humans casually touched each other's shoulders in greeting, how they laughed without checking if it was diplomatically appropriate, the constant sharing of food and stories. Tea. Chen appeared at her quarters door, holding 2 steaming cups. Another human ritual she'd initially dismissed as primitive. Now she appreciated the meaning behind it. Comfort offered without obligation. "Your shoulder?" he asked, settling beside her on the viewing couch. They watched the stars together, a habit they'd developed since her exile. "Healing." Her scales rippled with remembered pain. "Your doctors are surprisingly competent." High praise. His smile made her secondary heart skip. "Ready to talk about yesterday?" Corella's scales darkened. Yesterday, she'd fled from the compound's communal dining area after seeing something that challenged everything she'd been taught. A young Xeraxian child, obviously from a merchant family, playing with human children. They had been teaching each other games, the Xeraxian's scales bright with unrestrained joy. "On my world, such mixing is forbidden," she said finally. "We believe it corrupts our cultural purity." And now, she touched her thermal regulator. "Now I wonder what else we've forbidden out of fear rather than wisdom." A commotion outside drew their attention. The compound was celebrating something called Christmas in July, an artificial holiday created by Southern Hemisphere colonists who missed winter festivities. The concept would have once seemed ridiculous to her. "Come on." Chen stood, offering his hand. "My family's hosting tonight. They've been asking to meet you." "Your family." Both her hearts lurched. Meeting family was a serious step in Xeraxian culture, usually preceding formal bonding ceremonies. His expression softened. "Just dinner. No pressure. Though fair warning, my grandmother may try to feed you until you burst. It's how she shows love." Love. The word hung between them, heavy with possibility. The Chen family quarters were chaos by Xeraxian standards. Decorations mixed Earth traditions with colonial adaptations. Humans of various ages moved in practiced disorder, carrying dishes and telling stories simultaneously. An elderly woman, Chen's grandmother, directed everything from a hovering chair, her white hair crowned with something called a Santa hat. "Marcus," she called. "Is this your Corella? Bring her here. Bring her here." Corella froze. "Your Corella." But Chen's gentle hand on her back guided her forward. "Ah, beautiful," Grandmother Chen declared. "But too thin. Here, try these dumplings. Family recipe, 5 generations in space." Before Corella could protest, she was seated at a table that mixed human and alien dishes. Chen's younger sister taught her how to use chopsticks, laughing with her rather than at her when she dropped food. His cousin's Arturian spouse shared stories of their own cultural adjustments. No one seemed to care that she was Xeraxian, exile, or different. "They're overwhelming," Chen whispered apologetically, "but they're family. And family means nobody gets left behind." 3 different relatives chorused, clearly a familiar saying. Later, helping clean up despite Grandmother Chen's protests, Corella watched Marcus teach his young niece how to say thank you in Xeraxian. The child's pronunciation was horrible, but her enthusiasm was perfect. "I understand now," she said softly. Chen paused. "Understand what?" "Why humans advanced so quickly. You don't just adapt, you embrace change. My people see difference as a threat. Yours see it as an opportunity to grow." He moved closer, his warmth familiar now rather than alien. "And what do you see it as?" Corella's scales shifted through all the new colors she'd discovered since meeting him, settling on one she finally had a name for. "Freedom," she whispered. The Christmas lights painted patterns across his face as he smiled. Outside, human and alien children played in artificial snow, creating new games that belonged to neither world and both. Corella realized she was finally home. The summons arrived during another Chen family dinner. Corella recognized the ornate genetic seal immediately, her family's ancestral crest, used only for matters of grave importance. Her scales paled as she read it. "They're here," she whispered. "My family has come to pass judgment." Chen's hand found hers under the table. Over the past month, she'd stopped flinching at human touch. Now she drew strength from it. The meeting was set for neutral ground. the same Centauri exchange station, where they'd shared the dance of truth. Corella stood tall as her family's delegation approached, led by her clutch mother, Imperial Advocate Vicen. Daughter, Vicen's scales rippled with formal patterns. You have brought shame to 12 generations. I have brought truth, Corella replied, conscious of Chen standing supportively at her shoulder. Or shall we discuss Operation Primitive Purge? A necessary step to preserve our culture. Vicen's secondary crest extended, a warning, one you failed to understand. However, redemption is possible. Denounce the humans publicly. Return home. Your exile will be forgotten. Corella felt Chen tense behind her, but he remained silent. This was her battle. Before I answer, Corella said, explain something. Why do the oldest sections of our genetic archives contain human DNA markers? The question hit like a plasma burst. Vicen's scales shifted through shock to rage. You dare access sealed records. Dr. Chen's medical scans after the archive incident revealed genetic similarities that shouldn't exist. We investigated. Corella's scales rippled with challenge. Humans aren't our enemies. They're our ancestors. The revelation rippled through the watching crowd. Vicen's scales flushed dark with fury. Lies. Human corruption. The truth, Corella cut in, is that our ancestors were human colonists. They used genetic engineering to adapt to our world's harsh environment. Each generation modified themselves further until they forgot their origins. We didn't evolve naturally into Xeraxians. We chose to become this. Impossible, Vicen hissed, but uncertainty colored her scales. The proof is in our own archives, Chen added quietly. Records your leaders buried because they proved something remarkable. Your people didn't just survive on a death world. You transformed yourselves to thrive there. It's the most human thing imaginable. Corella watched comprehension dawn in the younger members of her family. Their scales shifted through colors of wonder and possibility. And now you would undo millennia of evolution. Vicen demanded. Corrupt our bloodline with primitive DNA. Evolution isn't about purity, Corella said, her voice carrying to all present. It's about adaptation, growth, change. She turned to Chen, her scales displaying colors that needed no translation. Love. The younger Xeraxians moved first, their scales showing support. Then the merchants, always quick to see new opportunities. Even some of the older conservatives wavered, centuries of prejudice battling with undeniable evidence. Vicen's scales darkened with resignation. You choose them over your own kind. I choose truth over lies, growth over stagnation. Corella felt Chen's warmth beside her, constant as a star. And I choose love over fear. Exile me if you must. But know this, we cannot stop change. We can only decide how to face it. The silence stretched. Then, remarkably, Vicen's scales shifted to a formal pattern of acknowledgement. Perhaps, she said slowly, it is time for the Empire to evolve again. Corella felt Chen's hand slip into hers, their fingers intertwining naturally despite their different forms. Around them, humans and Xeraxians began to mingle, centuries of barriers crumbling in the face of their shared heritage. Your grandmother, Corella murmured to Chen, will be insufferable when she learns she's technically my several hundred times removed ancestor. His laugh warmed her scales. She already considers you family. This just makes it official. Corella watched her people discovering their hidden past, seeing fear transform into fascination. There would be challenges ahead, resistance to overcome. But facing it together seemed right in a way her old life never had. Sometimes, she realized, exile from a cage felt exactly like freedom. 6 months after the revelation that shook 2 civilizations, Corella stood before a gathering unprecedented in galactic history. The Grand Chamber of the Centauri Exchange Station had been modified to accommodate both human and Xeraxian environmental preferences. One side warm and dry, the other cool and humid. The center a carefully maintained balance between the two. Like the environment, the ceremony itself was a fusion. Corella wore traditional Xeraxian ceremonial scales of hammered platinum, but they were decorated with intricate earth patterns. Chen wore a formal human suit with iridescent fabric that mimicked Xeraxian color-shifting abilities. "The universe," Corella began, her voice carrying to all present, "has a peculiar sense of humor. I was assigned to the human delegation as punishment. I was expected to prove their inferiority. Instead, I discovered something far more precious than superiority. I found truth." Her scales shifted through the colors of her journey, the harsh diplomatic neutrals of her past, the confused swirls of her awakening, and finally, the deep, rich hues of love that she no longer tried to hide. "Humans have a saying," she continued, acknowledging Chen with a warm glance. "Life finds a way." My people took that quite literally, transforming ourselves to survive an inhospitable world. But we forgot the most important part of that transformation: the courage to change, to grow, to become more than we were. In the audience, Vicenne's scales showed proud acceptance, a hard-won change that had taken months of bridge building. Beside her, Grandmother Chen beamed from her hover chair, wearing a traditional Xeraxian crest that somehow worked perfectly with her ever-present smile. "Today, we formalize not just a union between two people, but a reunion of long-separated branches of humanity's family tree. The Xeraxian Empire and Earth Alliance will maintain their independence, but we will move forward together, learning from each other's strengths." Chen stepped forward, taking her hand in the human way while his other hand touched her crest in the Xeraxian tradition. "My people engineered away our emotions, believing them primitive," Corella said softly. "We thought love was a weakness. But standing here, I understand what we nearly lost. Love isn't primitive. It's the most advanced force in the universe. It drives us to transform worlds, to cross stars, to become more than we ever imagined possible." Her scales rippled with joy as Chen's fingers intertwined with hers. In the audience, young Xeraxians displayed their colors openly, while humans leaned forward, fascinated by the play of light and emotion. "This isn't just a love story between two people," Chen added, his voice carrying the harmonics he'd worked so hard to master. "It's the story of two peoples remembering that difference isn't something to fear, it's something to celebrate, to learn from, to love." The ceremony concluded with both human and Xeraxian traditions. They exchanged rings that matched Corella's ceremonial scales, and their scales and skin were painted with temporary pigments that told their story in both cultures' symbols. Later, at the celebration, Corella watched human children teaching young Xeraxians to dance, while Xeraxian elders shared ancient stories with fascinated human scholars. The barriers between species had dissolved into curiosity and connection. "Having second thoughts?" Chen asked, joining her at the observation window. "About us? Never." Her scales rippled with contentment. "About everything else. I think second thoughts are healthy. They mean we're still growing, still evolving." "Speaking of evolution," he grinned, "Grandmother insists our children get the best of both worlds. She's already talking to geneticists about compatible DNA sequences." Corella's scales flushed with possibilities. "We do have 12 generations of genetic engineering experience." They watched the stars together, no longer divided by the void between them. Corella remembered her first impression of Chen's eyes, how they had seen through her diplomatic armor to the truth beneath. Now those same eyes looked at her with love that transcended biology, culture, and space itself. "So," he said softly, "ready for our next evolution?" Her scales answered before her words could, displaying the colors of their shared future, brilliant, complex, and beautiful in its infinite variety. "With you?" she smiled. "Always."